Hi, I'm Ted Wolfe, presented by GuideWise. Welcome to the Implementors podcast, where we connect you to the stories and insights of people who have mastered implementation. Why? Because ideas are easy, but implementation is hard. Join us as we uncover the secrets of successful implementation so you can conquer your implementation struggles. Welcome to the Implementors podcast presented by GuideWise, where we focus on the topic of implementation because ideas are easy, but implementation is difficult. Today, our guest is Jim Huling, author of the #1 best-selling book, The 4 Disciplines of Execution. It's a cornerstone framework used by over 300,000 teams globally. Today, we go beyond the theory and we talk about what it takes to actually implement change in the face of distraction, competing priorities, and human resistance. Jim, welcome to the Implementors. We're thrilled to have you on the show.
Ted, thank you. I've literally been counting the days till I had the opportunity to have this conversation with you guys and to be part of this great podcast. So thank you for the invitation.
Well, thank you for being here very much. The 4 Disciplines of Execution is a book that I have read numerous times. Over 300,000 teams globally are using the doctrine, if you will. How did you come about writing that book?
I love this question, because in some ways it's the story of this whole chapter of my life. I'll take you all the way back quite a ways, the early 2000s. There was a small group of us at Franklin Covey who were pondering the dilemma of a very particular problem. And I'm sorry to say the problem still exists today in some ways, but our calling, we felt, was to find a solution. And that was simply this. Company after company, leader after leader, team after team were all brilliant at creating strategies. Ted, I know you're going to nod your head in just a minute, especially coming from our corporate and shared backgrounds that we had. But, we make these strategies and they're literally works of art. We have graphics people who make PowerPoint slides and we have a soundtrack in the background and the whole thing is just this beautiful production. And when people hear the strategy, they're in awe and they can't wait, to see all of this implemented. And it's really a great moment in the life of a leader, that moment. But the sad part is that's actually the best moment right there. That's your peak. Yep. Because then you're faced with the daunting challenge of getting a team of people to execute on all the things that those beautiful graphics conveyed. And it just turns out that while strategy and execution are both critically important, execution is way harder than strategy, mostly because all strategies at some point devolve into getting human beings to do something differently or better than they have been doing. And changing human behavior, if you've never tried to do that, that's really hard, So the big challenge was, why does execution fail when strategies look so brilliant? And we came back with after a long time and a lot of thought, what we thought were 4 simple answers to solving that particular dilemma on what is, for most leaders, the most pressing and sometimes urgent challenge that they have. And that's why we ended up with 4 disciplines to solve that problem.
Mm-hmm. And what was it like when you brought it out? I'm sure you had a very nice presentation put together, great ideas. What kept people motivated to do it?
Yeah. Were you there? You sound like you were actually in the room, Ted. And I'll tell you, in the beginning, the interesting thing, and I'm very proud of this story, and it involves more than just me. Of course, I'm the spokesperson for it today, but there were a lot of really smart people involved. We had the thought that we should implement something before we start trying to teach others to do it. And so we had the beautiful luxury of being with, still in my vernacular, Ted, the world's greatest company, the Franklin Covey organization, gave us a period of time in which we did 1,000 implementations of these 4 disciplines to learn from them, to modify them, to strengthen the weak spots, Before we ever put word 1 on page 1 of any kind of a book, we had 1,000 implementations under our belt. And one of those, for example, was with the Marriott Corporation, the largest hotel company in the world. We had implemented the 4 disciplines across scale and across geographies. So we had a beautiful, wonderful glide path into knowing what we were talking about before we started trying to convince others that we knew what we were talking about. And I think that's really the success of these 4 disciplines has in large part come down to the luxury of beginning in that way. Most authors of methodologies are in a rush to get their methodology out into the world, and we had the luxury of proving the concept before we tried to teach it to others.
Well, my congratulations. You did a very good job of that, and you didn't put the cart before the horse. You definitely went out and proved that the model's effective and worked before you went out and marketed it.
Thank you.
Let me ask you then, though, why do teams, they got very high qualified people, they're motivated, they got a career that they want to build, but for some reason they can't get it together and they still can't implement a project?
Yeah.
What did you find? What's the root cause?
And by the way, can you hear the gravity in your own voice when you ask that question? I think every leader just empathized with the way you asked that question. They're all thinking, yeah, Ted's been there. Yeah. He knows what he's talking about. And I'll tell you two things that come to my mind right away. One pragmatic and one a little bit philosophical, if you don't mind. The pragmatic one is simply that take what you just described, very, very smart people faced with very large challenges and a strong desire to solve those challenges, never go the path of simplicity. When we have a complex problem, we don't naturally think, well, let's find the one thing that would make all the difference. Our minds don't work that way. We have a large complex problem. We tend to create a large complex solution. And so what may turn out as a complex challenge ends up being 47 individual initiatives or goals, all of which, by the way, are designated as priority one by those in the power to designate such things. And then the poor team of people down at the front line says, okay, we got 47 things. We got to be great at all of them. So in other words, I'm not really trying to be funny. That's a very real situation. And the frontline teams are defeated before they even begin. So without meaning to, Ted, and I think you're going to nod your head when I say this, we really create a situation where people try to survive the execution methodology rather than implement the execution. Yeah. They just say, how can I keep my head down and not be visible until this passes? Because, the truth is most leaders will read another book and they'll get excited about another methodology if you just give it enough time. So that's problem number one. We have too much complexity in the solutions that we provide. And then I want to say, secondly, and this is more of a current times. I'm currently coaching a lot of CEOs around the world, and they're all facing the same challenge of we may have clarity on the execution side, but nobody really cares. It's just my job. I'm trading some hours for some dollars. I'm doing whatever you're asking me to do, but I can't work up any genuine passion about the achievement of that goal. And I think that's because for too long, we've asked people to give their highest and best gifts toward things that really weren't that important, or at least they had no idea why they might be important. So the inability of leaders to connect a goal to actual meaning, why I should bring the best of my talents and my abilities to this. We failed on that part. So we've asked people out of compliance to work, but we've not tapped into their own desire to do something great with their lives. So when you put those two things together, you've almost got a perfect storm of complex solution and a lack of motivation to actually be part of it. You put that together, that's not a good recipe.
Yeah, I know I've been in business my entire life, have many war stories and scars on my back to talk about what you just mentioned. And at one point I was a chair leading peer advisory group, well known in the United States. And I did that for 5 or 6 years. And the joke was when I'd walk into a company, the employees would say, oh, every month when he comes back from that meeting, we know he went to the meeting because it's a different idea that's a priority this month. So we just have to wait out the month and another one will come next month.
I love that.
So that took me back to the point in your book. What organizes all these people? What brings all those ideas together instead of being random ideas, relevant ideas? And I think that is what you call the wildly important goal.
That's exactly right.
How did you come about hitting on that?
Yeah, WIG for short. So if I use that by accident, WIG, WIG, wildly important goal. We came up with that label simply because we needed a name that had more impact than saying important, because every company we worked with already said all of their goals were all important, which in essence is the problem. So the very beginning of the 4 disciplines of execution, I think in many ways is the hardest discipline for a leader to implement because it's the discipline of focus. In other words, we say to a leader, you need to decide what are the one or possibly two most important outcomes you're going to be driving this year or in the next period of time. And Ted, I don't know if you'll laugh out loud when I say this, but of course, we have this shared history. If I ask a leader to tell me the 12 most important outcomes, they wouldn't even blink. They would rattle them off like a machine from memory, Yeah. And even if I pushed a little bit and I said, well, give me the 6 most important, no problem. They'd rattle them right off. But when you say 1 or 2, and that's all you get to pick, everybody stops. And I think the stopping is not the absence of intellect or commitment or sophistication in any way. I think the stop is I have no idea what to choose, and I don't want to have to choose, right? So I would prefer actually the flying high cover of 6 or 12 goals, and we're kind of working on all of them, as opposed to the high accountability of, well, we've only got 1 or 2, and we have to succeed at those 2. But if you're hearing me, you can see that's a powerful first step. The need to be clear about what matters most is the first discipline in the 4 disciplines of execution.
Well, what I loved about the 4 disciplines, the first one sets the stage. Here's what we're going to do to take a man to the moon and bring him back. And that's in your book about Kennedy, President Kennedy. And what I find interesting is as I go through different companies, talk to them and reflect back on my own business, a lot of times communicating that single goal throughout the organization is a big challenge. I could go to my business, and we had 13 offices across the United States.
Yes.
I was proud that I could go and ask people what our priorities were in each office, and they'd tell us the same thing. That took a lot of hard work to do it. But in your book, The 4 Disciplines, you seem to simplify that by the second one, act on lead measures. It communicates exactly what needs to be done. Why do people have such difficulty identifying in your mind the lead measures and then consistently talking about them, communicating and reinforcing the goal?
What a great, insightful question. I'm so honored because it is so clear that you have studied this book and you know it well. You're asking a really insightful question. And I'll tell you the 2 things. One is I want to violently agree that the greatest distance in any organization is from the boardroom to the front line. It's the march that most people don't make. And so the litmus test for me, even today when I'm coaching, I have a CEO who in a very confident way says, I want to tell you one thing I don't need any help with is clarity. We've got clarity. And if I can drop in and chat with a few people in the lunchroom and just simply say, hey, what are the most important goals in the company? And they either don't know or they don't say the same thing, then I know that clarity stops somewhere below the boardroom and before the front line. So I think that's a big part of it. But if you go past that for a minute, let's just say you have the discipline and after rigorous debate and late nights and a lot of pizza, you say, hey, here's the 2 most important goals for the whole year. This is what we're going to hang our hat on, is these 2 outcomes, driving them to a level of excellence. Well, the next question everybody says is, well, okay, great. Now that we know what we're going to do, how are we going to do it? And I'm not trying to be humorous. I mean, this could bring you to tears if you don't know the answer to this question, right? And Ted, most leaders, and I'll tell you, my heart goes out to them when I say this, I'm not being critical, in the absence of knowing specifically what to do, will simply try to do everything. They'll do everything they can think of. So they'll send their teams out on a mission to perform 8, 10, 12, 15, 35 individual initiatives, all of which they think will have the cumulative effect of driving the goal. But the truth is, most of that is wasted effort because the effort is going into activities that don't drive the outcome. So we lean into a very old idea called the Pareto principle. 20% of what we do produces 80% of what we get. And I'm applying that loosely in this case, but I think the idea is the same, that we accept that a few of the things we do produce most of the results we get. But the problem is nobody knows what those are. So the first step of lead measures is you have to do a little trial and error to be able to find what's correlated and what's causal to the outcome that you want. And if you find that, you end up almost having this magical effect. I mean, for people who've been doing 26 things and not seeing a goal move, and you say, hey, everybody, we're going to double down on these 3 things. Everybody's going to do these 3 things at this level of excellence. And all of a sudden, a team sees the needle move for the first time in months or even years. I'm not being dramatic to say it's a celebratory moment. Mm-hmm. And they look back to you at the leader, Ted, almost like, God, you guys really do know what you're doing, because they're used to working hard and not seeing those results. Mm-hmm. And now they have the chance to work just as hard, not necessarily harder, but smarter, and see the activities that they're doing actually start to move the needle. That's a moment of celebration in most teams, and an incredible moment of relief for the leader. You finally figured out the equation of what do we need to do in order to get the results that we want.
And I think the beauty of your approach and what you just described there is that when people start to see direct correlation, cause and effect between what I do and that number moving,
exactly,
you get ownership and people get motivated, and I can make a difference in my life becomes their belief. And you got to get people to believe it before you can get them to do it.
Boy, that's beautifully said. You're almost inspirational in the way that you say that, And I'll tell you why I think I hear inspirational in your voice is because you know how heartbreaking it is to work really hard and not achieve the outcome.
Yeah.
So that's a really beautiful way to put that.
So my question, Jim, is once people see that cause and effect, let's say they go 90 days and they see consistent increases. I've noticed in some executive ranks, they start to get disconcerting in that, oh my God, they're going to ask for a raise. Oh my God, they think they're going to run the company now. Oh my God, all this and all that. Did you find that in your experience to any extent?
I want to be really credible to everybody who hears me, and you and I both are generationally people who've proven whatever we're trying to talk about. So I hope we bring that to this answer is almost never did we find a team of people who said, we're only going to do this if we get paid, or now that we've done this, we ought to get paid. We haven't seen that.
Good.
Now, there's no question that for outcomes, for the wildly important goals, the 2 most important things that have to happen this year, teams that achieve those are due something, right? I'm not trying to say they're not. There's a just and honorable reward that should go with over or high achievement in all cases. But we never found teams that would sort of hold the company hostage to the results driving activity, the lead measures. Never found that. And I'll tell you why I think this is true. Because when you're on the front line and you are used to working hard and not being successful, when someone helps you see a way to work hard and be successful, you're pretty busy being grateful for that, because it changes the whole atmosphere of the place that you work and your own sense of whether the work that you're doing is making a difference. And I think that's probably why there's not been a backlash for pay for performance on the lead measure side.
Yeah. So when you see success happening, and I'll say you use the word whirlwind in the book very, very definitively, and it's excellent.
Thank you.
Do you think success breeds comfort, a little laziness over time?
You asked the question really precisely. Do I think success breeds comfort, and that may lead to a degradation in performance? And it hasn't been my experience, but I have a close second to what you asked, which might even be a different way of asking the same thing. I think once the initial exhilaration of we finally found a way that works, once that becomes normal, every human being naturally then gravitates to, am I doing something that matters? Right. So you and I grew up in a time when you, for the most part, you were just glad to have a job. And if you were told to do something, your job was to go and do it. And gosh, Ted, I remember not thinking a lot as a young professional about meaning. And I find today, especially the newest generations that have entered the workforce, are all about meaning. They literally want to know, in a sense, I'm happy to do what you've asked me to do, but before I start, could you please help me see that why it matters? Why is this important? What difference is this going to make? They're really asking questions I wished I'd asked in my 20s. So I'm proud of them for asking the questions. But I think the absence of meaning causes a sharp degradation in performance once the riddle has been solved. We now know how to raise our customer satisfaction number, for example. And once the exhilaration of that is over, then I think people over time start to say, well, okay, but what difference is this really making? And the search for meaning and the ability of a leader to connect activity to some sort of meaningful outcome, I think that's a new requirement for all leaders today. And honestly, I think it's a good one. We should be required to make that connection for people.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I see the younger people coming in, younger generations, and they are asking those tough questions. And I'm so glad they have the opportunity and the courage to do that. I think organizations that I've seen that succeed over time are ones that do create meaningful work. There's a purpose for being there. You may go back to Maslow's theory, hierarchy of needs, etc. But creating meaningful work can be extremely difficult. So when you are implementing the 4 disciplines and you are looking at the WIG, the big goal, what's going on, you got the leading measures in place, the scorecard, which is number 3,
yes,
I believe is a fabulous instrument to keep the competitive juices going.
And to what I think you were about to say, I hope I didn't interrupt you. Just was and to connection to meaning as well. Let me give you 2 really fast examples. So we once worked with an incredibly large hospital that had a terrible problem that accidents in the operating room were going up. There are technical names for all of this, but the layman's language was, person's being operated on and something goes wrong. Those are called perioperative incidents. Well, the hospital had those on the rise. And these are people, healthcare professionals, more than anybody else are mission driven. They go into that profession in order to save lives and restore the quality of lives for people. So if you're getting the opposite result, everybody cares a lot about that. Well, when we got to the simple action that would remove that, we actually reversed the trend and perioperative incidents started to dramatically fall to a nationwide leading level. We did it by a simple behavior done repetitively before every surgery, but done with real excellence. Those people connected the 4 disciplines to saving lives. So you see, for them, they not only had an intellectual interest because they were producing better results, they had a personal meaning type influence that came from that. And every time the scoreboard showed the drop, they would gather in a circle and cheer at the end of the shift. That we went down again this week. Yes, a kind of thing that you can't manufacture. You can't really force that into a team. But when it's a natural byproduct of succeeding at something that matters, that's the combination, then you have a recipe for high engagement that I think personally is better. There are lots of good techniques about driving engagement, and gosh, I'd encourage everybody to do everything you think that can help. But I think the thing that ultimately drives it is, am I doing something that matters, and are we succeeding? And if you can put those 2 things together, you'll have high engagement on your team, particularly even with, as we said already, the younger people that are coming into the workforce.
Yeah. I find that if I can change the conversation just a little bit, take off on what you had said, when you find something that really is important to you and it is meaningful, it brings in emotion, and emotions drive performance for the most part. And that's embodied in a person's culture. So I want to go a little bit, if I can, into leadership, culture, and change if possible. So when you look at, you've met an awful lot of leaders in businesses. An awful lot of leaders in business. I don't know if you can give a number 1 behavior, but what's one of the most important behavioral, I'm going to say, attributes of a leader that really drives effective execution in a business?
Wow. I don't know if you'd allow me a small license to say 2 things, because it allows me to give a pair of things that I think probably come across well. So I'll say number 1, pragmatically, that clarity is the greatest missing thing in all of corporate America, or all of corporations around the world, in the sense of, we've talked about it today. Can I have a few number of goals? Can all the goals of all the teams below that be aligned to those 2? No others, no specials out there. We're mission driven. That kind of clarity solves a lot of the challenges leaders face today. But then I think the second part of it, is a word is getting maligned a little bit these days, but I think it's empathy. I think it's the ability to be a real human being leading real human beings, and to be willing to be honest and to be willing to be vulnerable when it's an appropriate way of doing it, and when to show that you genuinely care about something. Or if you don't know the answer, you don't try to fake the answer. You're a real human being leading real human beings. A phrase I get to say a lot in my coaching work these days. I think then people resonate and they gravitate towards you, and they're willing to try what you're asking them to try to do. But if you are only about performance and you're not about the people, then you will get at best what I would call compliance. Ted, can I say one last time? You and I remember the day when you did what your boss told you to do because you were afraid if you didn't, you'd be fired.
Right.
So that drove teams that were highly compliant. They would do what you said to do. Right? Who wouldn't in those cases, right? But the problem was all you ever got from those teams was compliance. There was a ceiling that they would hit. They're not going beyond that. Then when we bring in meaning and these human elements, when we make the workplace more human in a sense, we can tap into what really makes people be engaged. And engaged people will rise above compliance to commitment. So anybody who's ever been a leader for more than 5 minutes can say, I understand the difference, Jim, between a team that's compliant and a team that's committed. And a lot of my work around the world these days as an executive coach is helping leaders close the gap. How do we raise compliance all the way to commitment so that people are not only working from their minds, but they're working from their hearts as well, which is great work to be able. I'm sure that's the work you're doing as well, my friend.
Yeah. Well, I've been doing my homework for this particular conversation. I believe I read where you had one time had said that within every wildly important goal, there's a crisis. Do you find that to be the place?
Sure.
The start?
I do. And I try to be careful. When you've been doing this as long as I have, and you've written several books, you have, first of all, you have to say, did I really say that? So no, I'm only kidding. I remember saying that. And I'll tell you what I meant on that day, and I'll give you the 2025 version of that. So what I meant on that day, that I said that very publicly, was that it seemed to me that without a crisis, people couldn't engage at the highest level, that they needed a crisis as the catalyst. If I was going to make a terrible metaphor, I would say the person who needs a heart interruption in order to eat right. They needed something that catalyzed their efforts. Today, I think the 2025 version of that is, but wouldn't it be great if you could activate that same level of passion and excellence without needing a crisis? It's kind of easy if you're a leader and you can walk into the team and say, guys, this is our year. If we miss our goals this year, the whole plant will be shut down. That's kind of easy in the sense, but the problem is that kind of motivation burns off after a while. You can't sustain, it's like running a sprint. You can't sprint the whole race. So the better leaders and the better way is when you have a meaningful outcome and you can say, if we do this, look at the difference we will make. Look at the lives we will impact. Look at the things that will happen. Let's get motivated around that. And when you have that, then you have not only a deeper sense of motivation, but you have one that's more sustainable than the momentary effect of a crisis. I only wish I'd given that better answer several years ago when I said it had to be a crisis.
Yeah, no, very good, very good. Today, a common term that everybody throws around is emotional intelligence, and that means I'm becoming self-aware of my own emotions, my emotional patterns, and I'm trying to develop, I'm going to say, the intelligence to better manage them.
Yes.
Do you find that to be a key topic of conversation with business leaders today?
I would like to say to you, I think it should be a key topic, and sometimes it is, but I think we still live in a world where many leaders give themselves a pass on everything except clarity and accountability. They somehow feel if they've just got that, here's exactly what you're supposed to do, and here's what will happen if you don't do it. They drive through clarity. They've become so accustomed that that's where they stay. But I want to say, Ted, really quickly, you and I are in that generation, and we're having a very different conversation today. And I want to also be fair to leaders, to senior leaders, that we're asking something of them that they never experienced. You and I probably never worked for a leader who had great intelligence and also great empathy. We probably did. Now, maybe we did, and maybe you were lucky. But even if you did, you would acknowledge that's very, very rare. So, you know, the old expression, it's hard to be what you can't see. A lot of today's leaders have no visual model in their heads of what that even looks like. So when I start talking to them about, along with these wonderful, clear disciplines of execution, can we bring in the sense that you genuinely care about the welfare of this team, that you genuinely care of whether each person feels that we're investing in them and they're growing, that you genuinely care if they are struggling, that you appreciate that and help them as a human being to a human being would. If we bring that in, we can take the incredible power of clarity, combine it with the incredible power of a kind of emotional intelligence, which to me all sounds like genuine caring. And then we become leaders for whom people will run through a wall. Will do almost anything. You know, I know leaders like that. We wrote about many of them in our book, whose teams will literally do anything for them because they know that leader believes in them, you know. Ted, if you don't mind, I'll say one thing really fast. There's an old expression that I like to quote that says, where do you find people who are passionately committed to their work? It's like a Zen koan kind of question. Where do you find people who are genuinely passionate about their work? And the answer is you find them working for people who are genuinely passionate about them.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. You know, I find it interesting, talk to a lot of business people through the podcast and other consulting types of things that we do. And as with you, I believe, I was raised in business school to not bring emotion into business. You make business decisions, not emotional decisions. But that's the crux of what I think the younger people are saying that was missed. You can't make a business successful even if you have AI without the people, and you have to recognize them. So when 4 generations right now are working in the same business, I find many executives who never, as you had said, had that experience, and now they see their younger employees on fire when someone starts talking to them about it, and a puzzled look gets on their face, and they're saying, I'm not sure where to take this.
That's right.
Those 4 generations working together can be very difficult. They all have different preferences for technology, people interaction, things like that. How do you think and how do you see this working and unfolding in the near future within organizations and their evolution and how they make decisions?
Of course. It's a beautiful question. And I feel a sort of a weight in the hope that I give an answer worthy of that. You ask a really powerful question for the world we're in today. And all I can really come back with that I feel will hold up as people listen in their cars or on their laptops, so this conversation we're having today, is that we have to combine the rigor of clarity about what needs to happen with this genuine interest in the people who do it. I think I've often thought this small thing, if you don't mind me saying it, that every single person who comes to work every day has a blank piece of paper on which they want to write the answers to 2 questions. Question number 1, am I doing work that matters? And question number 2 is, does anybody care? So leaders who get better at explaining and helping teams to see why the work they're doing matters are 50% of the way down the field, but only 50. Because the other part of that is, does anybody care? Is anybody watching? Is it if I stay extra tonight and I give extra effort and I found the solution to a problem, 3 days faster than we would have otherwise, does that matter to anybody? I'm not saying, I don't think the young people want you to throw a party every time we do something good. I don't see anybody asking for that. But I do think they're looking for some kind of recognition that the effort you expended was noticed and it was valuable and it's appreciated. It's a simple equation. And I won't go there, but it's not a small leap to all human relationships tend to thrive on the principles we're talking about today. Why do we think business excludes those things? I think it's the opposite, Ted. I think you agree with me. I think business is enriched
Absolutely.
when we bring in care and compassion and a degree of care, of concern for the people that we lead. That I love when Simon Sinek, says it's not about the people you're in charge of. It's about how you handle that the people in your charge. I'm probably
Right,
not saying
exactly.
that,
No,
but
no,
they're a very
yes,
powerful quote.
it's very
It's
powerful.
really about that, right?
So, creating meaningful work. Let's just say an individual goes into their daily routine. Um, a lot of that good metrics are defined. They go home, they feel like they never got something done. You use that word in your book called Whirlwind. I'd like you to define that word if you could, and what gets people out of that. Because so often, if I may add, so often you talk to people and they say, oh, I just didn't have time to do it. Oh, I just didn't have time to get to it. Oh, I'm just too busy. I can't sit down and think about that. So if you could help define that word whirlwind and how you can get people out of that to work more on the business, I'd appreciate it.
Oh my goodness, yeah. And in fact, you said that so articulately. I think anybody driving their car would say, "Wait, Ted, you just answered that question." I think because you did that, you said that brilliantly. We chose Whirlwind as a beautiful name for the never-ending, high-velocity, swirling, urgent collection of things that have to get done every single day. And we use the example of, no sooner do you set a goal and you say, this is what we're going to do this quarter. This is where we're going, everybody. Then the whirlwind rushes into the room and says, okay, but you got this and you got this and you got that, and this is due tomorrow. And this is, so in other words, that about 80% of any team's capacity is already fully accounted for by just taking care of the day-to-day things that in essence are life support for the team. Those are things, accounts receivable has to handle invoices and payments. The IT people have to keep the systems up and running. That's part of the whirlwind. So you don't have the luxury of saying, hey, we have a clean slate. What would we like to do with it today? We don't, almost every team at best has about 20% of their available capacity available to do anything differently. So now if you've only got 20% of the capacity to use, you got to get really smart about where you deploy that capacity to. And you don't even have to be able to do math to say, if you take 20% capacity across 10 initiatives, you're only going to make an investment in each initiative that's so microscopic, it won't even move the needle. You've got to narrow your focus, discipline one, in order to make the best use from a pragmatic standpoint of what's actually practical. So I think that's really the big issue. And we love the idea of whirlwind because once you give something a name, you know it when you see it. So the whole idea of, if I said to you, Ted, listen, you'll have that report at 9:00 tomorrow morning. When you come in, be on your desk, 9:00 tomorrow morning. And 9:00 rolls around and 10:00 rolls around and 11:00 rolls around. And I come rushing into your office and I say, oh, Ted, here it is. Part of you wants to say, okay, thanks. You're 2 hours late. And I think the implicit response that you should not even challenge is, oh, yeah, but you won't believe what kind of a morning I had. Well, take that times 100,000. That's a day in the life of almost every leader in almost every company in the world, right? So the beauty of giving it a name lets you recognize your adversary. You know what it is. And when you say, I'll have that by 9:00 tomorrow morning, I have to think in my brain, but wait a minute. What about everything else that has to be done tomorrow morning? Okay, I better make that 11. So it enables you to make commitments that you can actually fulfill, and you make those commitments more intelligently when you have a clearer understanding of the adversary, the whirlwind, the 10,000 urgent things that all have to happen today. It makes you better able to do that.
So I think the word whirlwind is genius, to be honest with you. Let's go back and continue with leadership. We talked a little bit about emotions, emotional intelligence, and things like that. How does a good leader manage a situation where they're trying to develop the wildly important goal and the fear of failure begins to emerge? Oh,
yeah. Well, what a great question. I mean, so far, your questions are off the charts, the best I've had in a long, long time. Thank you. There's a lot of preparation went into those questions. I know when I'm in the hands of a professional. And, I think the thing that I want to say the most is that for a long time, there was a belief in all leadership circles that you should set a goal well beyond the capacity of the team. And the belief was that by striving to reach that unreachable goal, we might not make it, but we would do more than we would have otherwise, right? That's a prevailing idea. One of my clients loves to say, when you shoot a water pistol, you aim above the person's head so that there are all kinds of metaphors.
Yeah.
Well, I today, as a person who helps a lot of people with execution, I think that's the most heinous example of gamesmanship that we've ever imposed on the people that we've led. Because you're saying from the beginning, it wasn't really the goal. In fact, in the worst case, Ted, you know this, leaders come back at the end of the year and the team says, oh gosh, we missed the goal. Boss, sorry, we tried really hard, but we missed it. And then the leader says, I have great news. That wasn't even the goal. I only needed 80% of that goal, and the leader thinks, am I a hero or what? And the answer is you're not. But here's the worst part. What happens when you give the goals for next year? What do people do? They do math in their heads. They're very smart. So it's really only 80% of that, right? That's all he wants. Yeah, okay. So now you got a team that starts out with only the 80%. So in other words, clarity, honesty, integrity ought to be the guiding principles of everything we do, and it applies nowhere more than goal setting. Yeah. So set a goal that represents the highest level of performance you think the team can reasonably perform, and balance that with whether or not you would call it winnable. When we send our teams out on the field to play an unwinnable game, we do the greatest disservice we probably ever do, other than be deceitful or lie to our teams. We send them out wholeheartedly to play a game that we know from the beginning they can't win. It's the worst thing we do. But if we set a goal that represents the best performance that we intelligently know they can deliver, balanced with the simple idea, yes or no, does it feel winnable? Now you've got a recipe. When you do that, when a team says, Ted, that's a challenging goal, but I think we can do it. When you get that response, you're off and running. You've got a team that's mission driven and they're ready to go. Anything beyond that has to be gamesmanship or to please your own boss or to hit some falsely established metric, and they will comply, back to our previous question, but they won't commit.
Yeah. And in sales, they call that sandbagging.
Yes.
Salespeople's forecasts come in below, owners come in above, we'll meet in the middle. I think there's a lot more thought and active, I'll say, integrity on both sides that could actually simplify the process.
And have the end result that people are more engaged in creating the outcome that you wanted from the beginning. Yes.
Exactly. In your experience with the 4 disciplines of execution, is there much of a difference between implementing it in a small company versus a big company?
Well, 2 answers, if I may. One is, don't be surprised. The same gap between strategy and execution that exists in a big company exists in a small company.
Yeah.
And I've had many leaders say, Tim, there's only 12 of us. Why are we struggling with this? Well, because underneath the surface, these human drivers of performance that we've talked about today, clarity, meaning, accountability, those are still at work. So whether it's times 12 or it's times 12,000, or one of my clients has 250,000 employees, whether it's on that scale, the same human drivers are really beneath it. And please don't laugh, Ted, when I say this. It's just as hard to get an entrepreneur or a small company CEO to narrow their focus to 1 or 2 goals as it is to get the leaders of a giant corporation to do it. You would think the small organization would say, oh yeah, no problem, A and B. No, it takes days. We have to have a long dialogue and a long debate, and lots of pros and cons have to be weighed. So it's just as difficult. The human drivers underneath it really turn out to be the same.
Okay. So we spend a lot of time talking about change adoption, and it's the people aspects. It's not the strategy that fails, and it's not that people fail, but it's their fears, their apathy in some things. I mean, you can picture someone goes into work and they want to ask for a special they plan for a vacation on a certain time and they come back and they say, well, no, you can't have it. You just ruin their production for the day for the most part. So taking this to the individual level, have you had any experience or have clients actually taking the rigors of the 4 disciplines of execution and applied it at the personal level of an individual improving themselves?
If there were one question I've been asked the most other than why is execution so hard, it would be this. This would be a very close number 2, is because there's such a natural applicability between the organizational implementation of the 4 disciplines and their use for personal goals. And I don't mind telling you that for many years, we kind of debated whether we needed to write a second book with 40X for people, But in all cases where the real value was organizational. But we have story after story after story of people who have said, hey, these things work. They work because they're based on principles, not just practices. The fundamental principle of focus, of leverage, of engagement and accountability. Those are always at work in anything that humans are involved in. So why not tap into those things? So we have story after story of people that have run a marathon, or children that have raised their grades in school, or degrees that have been completed in night school, or it runs the entire gamut of what you can imagine. And all that does, with great joy, I say, Ted, it just emphasizes that when you develop something based on principles, not just current popular practices, but bedrock principles don't change. Principles remain. So our principle of focus is always going to be the truth. And so if you build a strategy on that principle, it will last. It will be solid. Well, that's true of all 4 of those disciplines. We've often loved to say that we really didn't invent the 4 disciplines. We codified them in a business language so that they became more accessible to business leaders. But those 4 principles have been at work as long as there have been human beings doing anything.
Well, you have had in your life, and I know a little bit about your background from our conversation, you've had an awful lot of opportunities to be a catalyst for good in people's lives and in businesses. And I'm sure in its own way, that's extremely rewarding. What do you see for the future for Jim?
Future for Jim. Okay, thank you. I was about to give you a very articulate organizational response, and I'm so glad you ended on a personal. So I've had a long and wonderful career, and I'm happy and proud and grateful every single day of all the things I've gotten to do there. In some ways, it's surreal to me, Ted, the wonderful opportunities I was given to do different kinds of things. I will say quickly, though, that at this moment of my life, please don't laugh when I say this, Ted, I think I'm finally doing what I was really born to do.
I understand that.
I loved being a CIO and being a technologist. I loved being a CEO for all the years, even though those are hard, like dog years, CEO years. And I loved being a global managing consultant and being a teacher and an author and a speaker. Those were wonderful chapters of my life, and I'll always be grateful for them. But the last 3.5 years, I've been a full-time executive coach. And without trying to be dramatic, Ted, although I feel like I am being dramatic, I'm sorry. I finally arrived at the very thing I was born to do. I was born to help executives one-to-one in an intimate, safe, challenging, but holistic setting to find the level of greatness in themselves. That's what I was born to do. And I'm grateful that, the 37 years of boot camp that preceded this chapter of my life, I think they were all necessary. But I now today, I see them all as preparation for what I'm doing right now. I have 27 executive coaching clients. 19 of them are CEOs. There are 7 countries represented. When I closed a call this morning before I got to talk to you today, and I looked into the eyes of that executive, and I knew I had made a difference. I knew I had. I could see it in her eyes, a kind of joy, but also a kind of relief that she's leaving with an answer to a challenge she couldn't have found on her own. And so tonight, Ted, when my head hits the pillow, I'll go to sleep like a baby because I can say, I did good work today. I made a difference today. And so what's next for me, I hope and pray, is just more of this wonderfully rewarding work, and hopefully more conversations with you and a chance to answer excellent questions and explore ideas the way we have today.
Well, we could go on and on. I have so many questions, and talking with you is so easy. I have one last question that I want to ask. You had that conversation, and you looked into that person's eyes, and you saw they got it, and you made a difference. What was your emotional experience that moved you at that point?
Gosh, what a great question. And I know you saw my face just changed, didn't you? And it's because my heart opened up really big when you ask a big question, you know how Dr. Covey used to always say, begin with the end in mind. And one of the vivid ways he got us all to get to that mental place was being at our last moment and imagining what people would say in that last moment. Well, that's what I felt today when I closed that call, is that wonderful woman who I'm really privileged to coach every month and hopefully will be friends with for many years. When my last moment comes, she'll be a person who will say, Jim made a difference in my life. I found him when I was struggling. I found him when I was afraid. I found him when I was failing or coming off of a big failure and I had lost heart to restart. Whatever the stories are, people like that will be able to say, he made a difference for me. And that, and I'm a little bit emotional now, so I'm trying to finish well, is that's my legacy. Everybody in the world is going to forget the books I wrote and the records we set and the accomplishments and all the awards we got, and all that stuff there. All that's going to be forgotten. I'm totally at peace with that. Probably faster than you or I could imagine. That all goes away. And all that's left is whether we made an impact, we made a difference to the people that surrounded us in our lives. And if we did, our legacy lives on forever, because those people go on to make a difference in someone else's lives, and on. The ripple just moves outward and outward and out. And the reason I love that thought, sorry,
that's okay.
I promise you I was famous for long answers, is then that doesn't end. You live forever when you live in the minds and the hearts of the people who you've impacted. You live forever. You're always alive. They carry us with them, and so that's what's next for me. I hope building a larger and larger legacy of people who feel I made a difference in their lives.
Well, Jim, I would say to you in closing, you have made a difference in this conversation, and I'm sure it will be for our listeners. And I know for me, it was like almost talking to a long lost brother that I haven't seen for a long time. And I want to thank you for that. If somebody wants to talk to you personally, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
Thank you. What a wonderful thing to honor me with. And I have tried to keep this as simple as possible. So I now live on LinkedIn and you can find me on LinkedIn, and every single day of my life, I post a thought. I have 3 years and counting without missing a day of leadership, life, spirit. I talk about all kinds of things, but every day I post a thought that I think would be helpful to leaders. So if you're interested at all, just find me on LinkedIn. Please connect and do that. And then on my LinkedIn profile is a click button for an introductory session with me. If you're interested in coaching, or you'd even like to just find out what coaching with me would be like, click that button. We'll have a wonderful conversation. I'll make a new friend, and you might leave that conversation with a new coach. So please take advantage of that.
Very good. Thank you. Jim, I think this is the first of, I hope, many memorable conversations I have with you.
Me too.
Thank you very much for your time today, and make the best of the rest of your day.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, Ted Wolf here. I want to thank you for joining us for this Implementors video. The Implementors podcast is presented by GuideWise, where we, along with our vetted member community, recognize that ideas are easy, but implementation is hard. To learn more about getting things done with GuideWise, please visit us at guidewise.io. And to conquer your implementation struggles, please like and share this video and subscribe to our channel. Happy implementing.